The glass of juice shattered on the floor, splashing onto the hem of Cassidy's black uniform skirt. But that wasn't what made everyone freeze. It was the boy at table 7, the millionaire's son, who had just started crying silently, head down, shoulders trembling, both hands gripping his napkin tight. No one on the waitstaff was allowed to crouch to eye level with a guest, let alone make any kind of personal contact. But Cassidy knelt down beside the boy's chair anyway, whispering something no one else could hear, except his father. And for the first time all evening, Jackson Hale looked up from his phone. Belmare was the kind of restaurant you booked a week in advance just to dine beneath soft golden light and live jazz. It was where the elite met, over French wine, exotic appetizers, and handshakes worth millions. Jackson Hale walked in like he was born to sit in those leather chairs. A perfectly tailored suit, mechanical watch catching the light under a crisp white cuff, and a presence that made people step aside, not out of fear, but because of the cold, invisible wall around him. Milo, his son, followed quietly behind. The 6-year-old wore a gray sweater and little leather shoes, saying nothing, asking nothing, and taking his usual seat by the window without a word. Cassidy Moore had table 7 that night. She didn't know their names when they walked in, but she recognized the type instantly. Rich, busy, used to control. And there was something achingly sad in the way the boy sat across from him, like he already knew he didn't have the right to make noise in a grown-up's world. Cassidy poured the water, introduced the menu, and, just as she expected, Jackson never looked up from his phone. The main course arrived: squid ink pasta for the father, seared salmon for the son. Cassidy noticed Milo only touched his fork to the plate, then set it down. Meanwhile, Jackson was still typing, his fingers flying over the screen like someone's life depended on what was waiting behind it. 5 minutes later, Cassidy came back to refill their water, and saw the boy's shoulders trembling. Milo was crying. No sobs, no calls for help, no drama. Just silent tears dripping onto a carefully folded napkin. It was such a small scene, but it hit Cassidy like a punch to the chest. No one else in the restaurant dared approach, but Cassidy walked over. She knelt down, lower than Milo's chair. Reaching into her uniform pocket, she pulled out a handkerchief and gently offered it to him. And then, she spoke. Just one sentence, soft enough that only Milo could hear. But it was enough to stop the tears. He looked at her, eyes still red, but there was something new behind them. Like for the first time in a long time, someone actually saw him. And Jackson stopped typing. He had seen the whole thing. From the pain in his son's eyes, to the unauthorized act of a waitress kneeling, to the words no one heard but somehow stopped his child from crying. Jackson saw it all. Cassidy stood up, turned away, and went back to work like nothing had happened. She knew she'd broken the rules, knew it could cost her job, but some things you just do, especially when the only one who notices a child in pain is the one not allowed to speak. By the time dessert arrived, Milo had eaten a few spoonfuls, and Jackson still hadn't touched his phone. He was just watching his son, longer than usual. Then his eyes followed Cassidy as she passed the table, and for the first time all evening, the man didn't look through someone, he looked at someone. No words were exchanged, no thank you, no reprimand. But in that look, something cracked, and maybe, just maybe, something also began to heal. As she left the restaurant, Cassidy didn't dare look back at table 7. She wasn't sure if what she did was right, only that sometimes, if you don't kneel down, you might never sleep well again. Cassidy got home and took off her uniform apron as she stepped through the creaky wooden door of her 3rd-floor apartment. The hallway still smelled faintly of damp rain. She set her bag down on a chair and quietly stepped into the small bedroom on the left, where her daughter lay curled up under a dinosaur print comforter. Riley still had a slight fever. The doctor said it was just seasonal allergic rhinitis, not serious, but worth keeping an eye on. Cassidy sat at the edge of the bed, placed a hand on her daughter's forehead, and let out a quiet breath of relief as she felt the fever had gone down. One hand gently stroked Riley's hair, while the other slipped off her worn-out shoes. The wall clock struck 10. She'd been working 10 straight hours today, not counting the wait at the bus stop and the long walk home. She hadn't eaten since lunch. Cassidy didn't complain. She was used to this rhythm of life. Dinner was sometimes just old toast, breakfast a box of discount cereal. But what kept her going wasn't endurance, it was Riley. A kid with a bright, ringing laugh, who asked questions far too big for her age, and always saved the last piece of dessert for her mom if there was only one left. Cassidy walked into the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water. She leaned against the sink, head tilted back, eyes on the stained, yellowing ceiling. The boy from earlier flashed through her mind again. Those wet eyes, that desperate look, and the silent question no one else noticed, except her. She didn't know why she'd knelt down like that. Maybe because she saw a bit of Riley in him. Or maybe she saw a bit of herself, back when she too was just a child, quietly hoping someone would bend down and ask, "Are you okay?" Somewhere else in the city, Jackson stood on the balcony of his glass-covered mansion's second floor. Below him, the yard was perfectly manicured. Trees trimmed to precision, soft garden lights casting a warm glow on a flawless lawn. Inside, the steady footsteps of a housekeeper echoed, disappearing behind the spiral staircase. Milo had already been put to bed. His room had everything: an oak wood bed, shelves full of books, app-controlled robots, even a full VR headset. But the silence in that room was heavy. He didn't ask for a goodnight kiss, didn't ask if his father would be home tomorrow. Jackson stepped into his private library and poured himself a glass of red wine. He wasn't the kind of man easily shaken, but tonight's image clung to him. Milo didn't usually cry. Since Serena passed, he barely shed a tear. Or more accurately, he hadn't cried in front of Jackson. He walked over to his desk, where a small photo frame sat beside the computer. The picture was old, slightly faded. Serena was wearing a teal sweater, cradling a newborn Milo in her arms. She was beaming, eyes lit up like she was holding the whole world. It was a spring afternoon in the backyard, the day Serena told him, "You don't have to be a perfect father. Just be there when it matters." Jackson set the frame down, unable to look at it any longer. He'd never told anyone that the moment he felt like the biggest failure wasn't a boardroom defeat or a market crash. It was the day Milo asked, "Where did Mom go, Dad? Why isn't she coming back?" And all Jackson could manage was a hollow, "She went far away." Then he walked out, leaving his son standing alone in the massive living room, still holding an unfinished comic book. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because if he'd said anything more, he was afraid the cold, polished mask he wore every day would finally crack. Tonight, when he saw Milo crying over something Jackson couldn't name, and then stopping because of a waitress's words he didn't hear in time, something inside him pulled loose from where it had been buried for years. It wasn't anger. It wasn't jealousy. It was a kind of loneliness he didn't know how to explain. He took a sip of wine, the bitterness spreading across his tongue. The way Milo looked at that woman, the woman whose name he didn't even know, was a look Jackson hadn't seen in a long, long time. Not because Milo had changed, but maybe because Jackson hadn't been there to see it. That night, Jackson couldn't sleep. The way Milo had looked at the waitress haunted him, like a question he didn't have the courage to answer. He couldn't understand how a stranger had opened his son's heart in just a few minutes, and that terrified him. Maybe he was the one who'd never been close enough. The next morning, without warning, Jackson drove to the restaurant where she worked. It was a sudden decision, but one he couldn't put off any longer. He sat in his car with the engine still running, headlights casting a dull glow on the front windows of Belmare. Through the glass, he could see the same space where Cassidy had knelt beside his son the night before. The restaurant was still full. The same lazy jazz floated through the air. But tonight, no one was crying, and no one made him stop in the middle of writing an email. He stepped out of the car without calling ahead. The manager recognized him instantly and gave a hurried bow. "I want to see Cassidy more," Jackson said, flat and direct. Cassidy was in the back, checking inventory in the stockroom when she got called up. She froze the moment she saw him, hands in his coat pockets, eyes shadowed with exhaustion. For a second, she thought she was about to get reprimanded, but Jackson didn't waste time. "I want you to spend time with my son." The words came out emotionless, like a business proposal. Cassidy blinked, stunned, then let out a dry, sharp laugh. "What kind of person do you think I am?" she asked, her voice no longer soft like the night before. "Not a kind," Jackson replied, eyes fixed on her. "I just saw my son smile for the first time in a long while, and that happened when you talked to him." "So you think you can buy that moment back? With money?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled a business card and a check from his inner coat pocket. "You don't have to decide now," he said. "But if you agree, this is the first payment. I don't need a nanny, just someone to be there." Cassidy didn't touch the check. She looked at it like it was something dangerous. The amount written could cover nearly a year's rent, Riley's preschool tuition, and the asthma medication she'd been putting off buying. "You don't understand," she said quietly, one hand resting over the chest of her uniform. "I've spent my whole life trying not to become someone who lives for money. Poor or not, struggling or not, I've never sold my kindness." "I'm not asking you to sell anything," Jackson replied, placing the business card on the nearby table. "Just think about it. For him, not for me." Cassidy turned away before her emotions slipped out of control. She grabbed her apron and walked straight into the stockroom, back straight, but her hands trembling. 3 days later, Riley had a breathing attack in the middle of the night. The damp air made her lungs tighten fast. Cassidy ran 10 minutes, carrying her daughter to the nearest clinic because the ambulance was too slow. The doctor said if they'd arrived 5 minutes later, Riley might have passed out from lack of oxygen. Cassidy sat beside the hospital bed, still clutching the inhaler, her mind spinning with numbers. New inhaler, after-hours exam, taxi fare home. On top of that, rent was 3 weeks late. In her pocket, Jackson's business card was still there. She quietly took it out. The raised letters were firm beneath her fingertips. Hale Industries. A private phone number, no secretary, no assistant, just a string of numbers, and a chance. Cassidy looked over at Riley, still asleep, her chest rising in uneven breaths. She thought of Milo, those same eyes, that same silence when all a kid really wants is for someone to hold them. She dialed. When Jackson answered, his voice was as cold as ever, but this time she heard something else beneath it. Maybe anticipation. "I'm not calling because of the money," Cassidy said, her voice rough from the long night. "I'm calling because I think your son is a lot like my daughter. And if there's something I can do to make a child feel a little less alone, then maybe I should try." The Hale estate was so vast. Cassidy felt like a tiny speck lost in a space designed for people who never had to ask permission for anything. The car dropped her and Riley off at a side gate. One Jackson had arranged just for them, with a private path, a secluded garden, and even a small guest house tucked behind a row of perfectly trimmed elms. A place quiet enough to never feel like charity. Cassidy lifted Riley out of the car, still holding onto her worn-out backpack. Riley couldn't stop looking around. Her eyes lit up at the sight of the fountain, the ruler straight flower beds, and especially when they stepped into her own room. A princess bed, new stuffed animals, bookshelves overflowing with comics. The light in that room didn't come from the fixtures. It came from the mix of wonder and joy on Riley's face. Cassidy, on the other hand, felt a chill in the air. Not from the AC, but from the kind of cleanliness that felt almost sterile, emotionless. Still, she said nothing. She unpacked their things, met the housekeeper named Eliza, and accepted the invitation to join Jackson and Milo for dinner in the main hall. Their first meal together was wrapped in silence. Jackson only spoke when absolutely necessary. Milo said nothing at all. Riley quietly ate, then glanced at Milo and held out her little spoon. "I don't like carrot soup," she said. "Want to eat mine?" And just like that, it was the start of something. 3 days later, Cassidy found the two kids sitting under the staircase, using colored pencils to draw on a cardboard box, building a makeshift spaceship. Milo quietly explained the game's rules, while Riley giggled and added space monsters, really just stuffed animals wearing paper hats. Milo no longer avoided Cassidy's gaze. He started asking questions like, "Do you know how to fold paper airplanes? Or does Riley get scared of the dark?" Once, while Cassidy was in the kitchen with Eliza, Milo appeared at the doorway and said, "Miss Cassidy, can I tell you about the dream I had last night?" Cassidy couldn't hide how moved she was. But she knew it wasn't about her reaction. What mattered was that Milo had chosen to speak on his own terms in his own time. So she just sat beside him and said, "Go ahead. I'm not great at understanding dreams, but I'm really good at listening." Jackson started to realize something. He was no longer the center of his own house. Everything was still in order, but now there was laughter echoing from the backyard. There was Riley calling for Milo to come outside. There was the smell of fresh-baked pastries Cassidy had tried making in a kitchen that had sat unused for years. He didn't interfere. He just watched. Sometimes from the second-floor hallway, looking down at Cassidy arranging flowers, while Milo told astronaut stories to Riley, both kids curled up under a blanket in the middle of the day. Jackson didn't know exactly what the feeling inside him was, only that it was unfamiliar and strangely comforting, like a warm breeze slipping through a wall of stone he'd forgotten he built. Cassidy never overstepped. She didn't try to get too close, didn't try to be anyone's mother. She was just there when needed. She listened when invited, stepped back when it was time. One afternoon, Milo slammed his book on the table in frustration, unable to find a keyword for his homework. Cassidy simply said, "It's okay to be angry, as long as you don't hurt yourself or anyone else." Milo didn't respond. He just sat quietly for a moment, then went back to writing. Jackson heard it from the hallway. He stopped walking, hand resting on the railing, said nothing. He'd never thought he needed to learn how to raise his son. Not until that moment. That night, a light rain began to fall. Milo asked if he could stay in Cassidy's room. "I want to read with Riley," he said. Cassidy agreed. She laid a soft quilt down on the floor between two sofas, setting up a little nest of pillows. She picked a comic, short, simple, not too heavy, and began reading it in a calm, low voice. Riley leaned against her shoulder. Milo curled up nearby, his head resting on a pillow. The story was about a boy who got lost in a forest, but instead of trying to escape, the boy chose to stay and light up the woods with a small lantern. Cassidy read slowly, pausing now and then to ask, "What do you think about the boy choosing to stay?" Or, "Have you ever felt lost like he did?" Milo didn't answer right away, but he didn't turn away either. By the time the story ended, Riley was asleep. Milo was still awake, eyes half closed. He didn't ask to go back to his room. He just turned over and pulled the blanket up to his chin. Cassidy said nothing. She dimmed the nightlight and stood quietly. As she turned around, she met Jackson's eyes. He was standing in the doorway. He didn't say a word, just watching that scene, his son drifting off to sleep to the sound of a story, Riley clutching a teddy bear, Cassidy gently tucking the edge of a blanket before quietly stepping out. It felt like witnessing something rare, fragile, and real. Something called family, a word he hadn't dared believe could still belong to him. In the days that followed, the air in the house grew lighter, like a morning breeze. Milo no longer avoided Jackson's eyes, and Riley started calling Milo her space teammate. Cassidy remained quietly in the background, tidying up the long unused kitchen, reorganizing the bookshelf Milo liked best, checking on Riley every night to make sure her breathing stayed steady. Just when it all seemed to be settling, just when the cracks had started to close, the storm hit, and it came in a way no one saw coming. Cassidy was preparing breakfast when Eliza rushed in, tablet in hand, face pale. "You need to see this." The homepage of a gossip site lit up, with a bold red headline, "Billionaire Hale hires single mom to care for son, now she's living in the mansion?" Below it was a photo of Cassidy leading Riley through the side gate of the Hale estate, Riley smiling, clutching her teddy bear. Another shot showed Cassidy washing the car with Milo, both of them laughing, sunlight catching her hair like it had been staged. Cassidy said nothing for a few seconds. She scrolled, comment after comment, pity, mockery, assumptions, judgments. Someone called her a clever gold digger. Another wrote, "Waitress lands herself a billionaire. Respect." She set the tablet down on the table. Her hand stayed steady, but her eyes couldn't hide the hurt. That afternoon, her phone rang. It was the manager from her old restaurant. His voice was clipped, flat. "We think it's best you don't come back. The customers, they don't like this kind of drama." Cassidy hung up. She clenched her jaw, held the tears back. Then she walked out into the garden, where Jackson was in the middle of a video meeting beneath the back patio. The moment he saw her approaching, he ended the call. "I saw it," he said. "My lawyers are already on it. I'm suing the site for defamation and invasion of privacy." Cassidy stood still for a moment. Then she shook her head. "I don't need anyone suing on my behalf," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I just need you to tell your son why he cried that night. And why you weren't the first person to comfort him." Jackson went silent. For the first time, he didn't have an answer. That night, Milo was sitting in the small living room, reading. He wasn't paying much attention to the voices coming from the backyard until he heard his name. "I saw his pain," Cassidy said. "He's trying so hard to live up to what adults expect, but none of the adults are asking what he wants. You think I don't want to understand my son?" Jackson's voice came back, low and tight. "It's not that," Cassidy replied. "I think you've forgotten how to listen." Milo set his book down. He didn't go outside. He just stood behind the half-open door and listened to something he probably wasn't meant to hear. "I've paid you a considerable amount," Jackson said, "and I haven't taken another cent since the day I started," Cassidy answered instantly. "I stayed because of Milo, not the money." Milo heard everything, and he understood it the way a 6-year-old would. That Miss Cassidy, the one who told him stories, who listened to his strange dreams, was just another grown-up his dad had paid to be there. That night, when Cassidy came in to say goodnight, Milo turned his face toward the wall. She sat gently at the edge of his bed, her voice soft. "Milo, is there something you want to tell me?" He said nothing. "Milo?" He turned around, eyes colder than she'd ever seen, and it broke her. "Are you just another grown-up who was bought with money?" The question wasn't angry. It was a cut, sharp and direct. Cassidy froze. She wanted to explain, but didn't know where to start. "Milo, it's not like that. You don't have to say anything," he whispered. "Just like Dad, you're not really honest either." Then he pulled the blanket up over his head and turned away. Cassidy stayed there a while longer, but Milo said nothing more. When she finally left the room, tears were already burning behind her eyes. But she didn't let anyone see. Outside, the wind had started to rise, pulling thin sheets of rain across the night. Seattle had turned suddenly cold. The next morning, when Cassidy opened Milo's door, he was gone. The window was slightly open, rain drifting in. The room was untouched, calm, except for a piece of paper left in the middle of the bed, written in shaky, childlike letters. "Don't fake care. It hurts more." The early morning rain still hadn't stopped when Jackson was told Milo was gone. The window was wide open, rain soaking the blankets. Police had already been called, security footage around the estate was being checked, but no one saw Milo leave. He had vanished like a long-held breath, finally escaping into the world. Cassidy stood by the doorway, Riley clutching her sleeve, eyes full of fear. Eliza's hands trembled as she kept making tea she couldn't bring herself to drink. And Jackson, for the first time in years, had lost all of his usual composure. He said nothing, just put on his coat, got in the car, and drove off himself. On the road, his hands clenched the steering wheel so hard his knuckles went white. The rain warped everything beyond the windshield, but the images in his mind were terrifyingly clear. Milo's voice, "Are you just another adult who was bought with money?" And before that, his son's cold, unreachable eyes. The kind of eyes that told him, some losses don't come from someone leaving. They come from never feeling wanted enough to stay. He drove through old streets, the ones he used to take with Serena and Milo when Milo was small. He didn't know what he was looking for, only that he couldn't sit still, couldn't hand this off to someone else, the way he had handled everything in his life. A dirt road surfaced in his memory. Back then, Serena had laughed and said, "If you keep bringing your laptop camping, you're going to miss the look on Milo's face the first time he sees fireflies." It was the last time the three of them ever slept in the same tent. Then came the hospital, then the funeral, then the silence. Jackson turned onto the dirt path. The ground was wet, slick, tires slicing through puddles. He killed the engine, opened the door, letting the rain hit him full on. At the edge of the woods, the old campsite, a small figure sat curled under the weathered wooden shelter. Milo, knees pulled to his chest, hoodie soaked through. Jackson didn't call out, didn't run, he just walked, slowly, and sat down beside his son. Rain drummed steadily on the roof above. Milo didn't look at him, but he didn't leave either. "You know," Jackson began, voice low and rough, "I used to be terrified of failing. I thought as long as I provided enough, as long as I kept you safe, that was enough." Milo stayed silent. "But the truth is," Jackson's voice dropped, "what I should have feared wasn't losing you. It was that you might never feel like I was really there at all." A drop of water fell onto his hand, not from the rain. He didn't know if it was his tear or Milo's. "I'm not here to say sorry the way grown-ups always do," he said, "because I know sorry isn't enough." He shifted closer, gently placing a hand on Milo's shoulder. "I don't want to buy someone to stand beside you. I want to learn how to be there myself. Even if that means you'll see me weak, lost, or not very good at being a dad." Milo still didn't speak, but his shoulders trembled, not from the cold. Jackson opened his arms. He didn't force it. He just waited. And then, in a moment as fragile as breath, Milo leaned into him, soaked, small, but real. Jackson wrapped his arms around his son. He didn't say a word, just held him, tight, as if trying to make up for all the years he'd let him feel lost in a house that was supposed to be home. From a distance, the sound of a car rolling to a stop. Cassidy stepped out, carrying Riley, shielding her daughter from the rain. She took one step forward, then stopped. Under the cover of the trees, mother and daughter stood silently. Riley tugged at Cassidy's hand, whispering, "Is Milo okay, Mom?" Cassidy gave her hand a gentle squeeze. She didn't answer. She just watched. as father and son embraced for the first time in years in a rain-drenched forest that should have felt cold, but instead felt heartbreakingly warm. Late autumn sunlight filtered through the thinning leaves, painting the Hale estate's backyard in soft gold. The rains had pulled back, giving way to that rare kind of gentle, quiet air the season saves for only a few days. In the garden, Milo and Riley were sitting on the stone path, drawing with sidewalk chalk, arguing over whether elephants really needed long trunks. Jackson sat a few steps away on a wooden bench, watching them while folding a newspaper into a paper airplane, something he wouldn't have imagined himself doing just a few months ago. Cassidy stood beneath the trees, a warm cup of tea in hand. She hadn't moved back into the mansion. After that rainy night when Milo ran away, she and Riley had returned to their rented apartment, partly to let things settle, partly because she needed time herself. But the distance didn't stop the visits. Jackson often brought Milo to see them during the week, or took Riley to the estate on weekends. Cassidy no longer worked as a waitress, partly because the old restaurant wouldn't take her back, but mostly because she was rethinking her path entirely. Jackson had changed, clearly, gradually, but genuinely. He took Milo to school every morning, sat down for breakfast with him, learned how to fold paper planes, and started asking, "How are you feeling today?" Not out of politeness, but with real attention. Sometimes Cassidy caught him watching Riley as she played with Milo. His eyes were quiet, but warm, and something in her stirred. Still, she kept her distance. One week, Cassidy received a note from Riley's school. The fall play was coming up. The kids would dress as fairy tale characters and act out a story their class had written together. Riley had been chosen as the narrator. Not a lot of lines, but on stage from beginning to end. Cassidy had planned to go alone. But the night before the play, as she dropped Milo off after their day together, Jackson was already waiting at the door. In his hands, a small box of pastries, the kind Cassidy always brought for Riley when picking her up from school. "I'm not sure if Riley actually likes chocolate," Jackson said, a little awkwardly. "But I remember you bought this kind for her once." Cassidy took the box, unsure what to say. "You're planning to," she hesitated. "Go to the play," Jackson nodded. Not out of politeness. Cassidy didn't ask anything else. But the next morning, as she stepped into the school courtyard, she saw him already seated, second row, wearing a gray turtleneck and a long overcoat. He didn't look like a billionaire businessman. He looked like a dad trying not to be late, worried his kid might be disappointed. The play began. Riley was the first on stage, her hair in 2 braids, wearing a soft yellow dress. She held her chin high, voice clear. Our story begins in a small village. Milo sat beside Jackson, silently focused. Cassidy sat 1 row over and to the side, just far enough to see them both. Midway through the second act, the kids on stage started to get flustered, forgetting lines, mixing up cues. Riley fumbled with her tiny script, her face beginning to crumple. Jackson leaned forward, not a word, just gently rested his hand on the edge of the seat in front of him. Just enough for Riley to see. She looked at him. And in that moment, her expression softened. As the scene ended, Riley quietly stepped away from the line of kids, tiptoeing down from the stage, around the side, and without hesitation, climbed onto the seat next to Jackson. No one stopped her, not even the teacher. Cassidy started to rise, then paused. Riley reached out and touched Jackson's arm, saying nothing, then rested her head gently on his shoulder, as if it were something she'd always done, every night, at home. Jackson didn't flinch. He wasn't surprised. He just lifted his hand and gave Riley's a soft, slow squeeze. Cassidy didn't cry, but her heart tightened, not from pain, but from something quieter, deeper. Like the moment you realize something has changed, and for the first time, you're not afraid of it anymore. The play ended to a round of applause. Kids rushed down from the stage, running into their parents' arms. But Riley didn't go anywhere. She stayed right where she was, next to Jackson, chattering at light speed about how classmate A forgot their lines, classmate B switched roles by accident, but she remembered her whole first speech perfectly. Cassidy walked over. Riley held up her paper medal proudly. Cassidy ruffled her hair, her eyes meeting Jackson's. He stood up, as if to say something, then hesitated. Finally, he said, "I don't really know how to show things, but I'm learning, not just for my son, but for something I never thought I'd allow myself to want." Cassidy said nothing. She didn't need to. Riley had already made the choice, long before Cassidy had time to think it through. It was a crisp weekend afternoon. The last leaves of the season stirred gently in the breeze. Cassidy watched as Riley and Milo ran through the schoolyard, laughing under the fading autumn sun. She still kept a little distance. But the look in Jackson's eyes earlier, when he handed Riley that small box of pastries, it left something soft stirring in her. Something she wasn't quite ready to name, but couldn't ignore either. That night, when she got home, she found a message from Jackson. "I know today wasn't enough, but if you're willing, I'd like to take you to dinner tonight. Not to negotiate, just to say thank you." Under the soft golden light, old jazz drifted quietly through the air at the restaurant where it all began. Belmare, the place where Milo had once broken down in tears, where Cassidy had knelt beside him, where a boy had been truly seen for the first time. And now, it was the place Jackson chose to end an old cycle and open something new. He arrived early, reserved the same table in the corner, by the window overlooking the quiet, late autumn street. He brought no contracts, no proposals, just a simple invitation. A dinner, just a dinner, to say thank you. Cassidy arrived a few minutes late, wearing a simple deep blue dress. No jewelry, no lipstick. But Jackson had to catch his breath the moment she stepped in. She sat down, placed her bag gently by her side, and smiled. Not the guarded, polite smile she used to wear, but not completely unguarded either. Just enough to say, "I'm here. And maybe, I'm open to what comes next." "I thought we only ran into each other at school," Cassidy said with a light smile, glancing around the familiar restaurant. "Didn't expect you to choose this place." Jackson poured her a glass of water. "I figured, if something needed to end somewhere, it should also begin again in the same place." Cassidy nodded. She didn't say anything else. Back at the house, Milo sat in the living room, building with blocks next to Riley. The new nanny, a gentle, patient education student, was reading quietly on the sofa. Milo looked up just as Jackson was about to leave. "Dad," he said, "I think I'm okay now." Jackson froze for half a second, then nodded. "Okay is good." Dinner passed slowly, unrushed, easy. They ordered simple dishes. Cassidy talked about how Riley was learning to paint with watercolors. Jackson shared that Milo had been working on building a robot with his advanced Lego kit. No one mentioned the media, no articles, no lawyers, no past, just small stories, like two people were learning how to be friends. After a while, Cassidy set her glass down, her eyes drifting slightly. "Do you remember that night?" she asked, "when your son cried and I said something to him?" Jackson paused, then nodded. "I remember Milo's face. It was the first time I saw it lighten." Cassidy tilted her head slightly. "But do you know what I said to him?" Jackson looked at her, like he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. "I said maybe he doesn't need a solution. Maybe he just needs a father who looks at him." Jackson didn't answer right away. He looked down at his hands, then up again. This time he didn't look away. "I heard it that night," he said quietly. "But maybe? I didn't understand it until now." Silence settled between them. Then slowly he reached out his hand, not bold, not certain, but steady. Cassidy looked at it for a moment, then placed hers into his. Jackson gave a gentle squeeze. "It's not a confession," he said with a faint smile, eyes never leaving hers. "Not some grand declaration, just," he breathed out, "if I start from here, would you stay a little longer this time?" Cassidy didn't answer right away. She looked at him. Really looked, not to judge, but to search her own heart, to feel what was truly there. To see the light in his eyes and decide if she could trust it. She didn't say a word, she just smiled. And in that smile, no one needed to ask anything else. Because when someone who's been shattered smiles at someone who once locked his heart away, that is the answer. No words required, no confirmation needed. That night, as jazz played softly in the background, something shifted. Not a miracle, but two people taking patient steps toward not walking away. A family doesn't begin with paperwork or shared blood. It begins with a real look and a sentence that doesn't try to fix anything, only says, "I'm here." And just like that, a family was reborn. From a wound, from a child who once ran away because it hurt too much, and from a father who finally learned how to stay.